The soft chime above the entrance of Summit First Credit broke the early morning quiet as Jonathan Harris stepped inside. Dressed in a neatly pressed light blue button-down khaki pants and clean sneakers, he looked like any other customer, casual, unassuming, and focused. The bank's polished floors gleamed under the overhead lights, and the slow hum of early transactions filled the air. Jonathan wasn't here in his usual role. No staff meetings, no executive briefings, no strategic calls. Just a man making a personal withdrawal, $15,000 from his own account. A simple task in a bank he had founded with the goal of creating financial equity. But this morning, he chose to leave the title of CEO behind and enter as a regular client to experience the service his bank was offering firsthand. As he stood quietly in line, he noticed the man ahead of him, white, middle-aged, dressed in a sharp grey blazer, being greeted with effortless warmth by the teller, Rachel Cooper. Her smile was wide and genuine as she carefully counted stacks of $100 bills and handed them over. The customer thanked her casually and walked out, slipping the envelope into his coat without a second glance. Jonathan saw the number on the slip, 20,000. There were no questions asked, no second looks, no hesitation. It was a clean transaction, swift and seamless. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had seen this contrast before, too many times to count, but today he wasn't going to walk past it. When it was his turn at the counter, Jonathan offered a polite nod to Rachel and handed over his withdrawal slip, already filled out neatly. Along with it, he placed his driver's license, clear current and valid. Rachel didn't smile this time. She didn't offer a greeting or even make eye contact. Instead, she glanced briefly at the amount and then pushed the form back toward him. "We can't process this," she said. Her voice clipped and professional, but distinctly colder than it had been minutes before. Jonathan furrowed his brow, unsure if he had misheard. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone calm but firm. Rachel's expression remained stiff. "It's an unusually large amount," she replied. "Withdrawals like this can be suspicious." She still hadn't looked at his ID. Jonathan blinked slowly, the word hanging heavy between them. Suspicious. His pulse quickened slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "I just saw the gentleman before me take out more than I'm asking for without issue." Rachel's lips pressed together in a thin line. "That's different," she said. Without elaboration, Jonathan leaned in, slightly locking eyes with her. Different. How she didn't respond. Instead, she shifted her gaze toward the back office, where the branch manager stood, watching arms crossed face. Unreadable. Jonathan didn't need an explanation. He'd been here before. Not in this exact moment, but in many that looked just like it. Moments where tone, body language, and double standards painted a picture louder than words ever could. What stung more wasn't just the refusal. It was the ease with which Rachel dismissed his right to be treated like any other client. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about security. It was about perception, about who was expected to carry money and who was expected to prove they earned it. The irony of being profiled inside his own bank settled like a weight in his chest. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. Instead, Jonathan simply stood there collecting his thoughts and deciding on his next move. The silence stretched uncomfortably between them, as Rachel kept her eyes on the form, refusing to look up. Customers nearby pretended not to notice, but Jonathan could feel the shift in the room, the quiet awareness that something wasn't right. And that's when he knew this wasn't going to be just another quiet insult to swallow and move on. From today, they had challenged the wrong man, and though they didn't know it yet, the very foundation of their assumptions was about to be shaken. Jonathan didn't let the moment pass without addressing it. He stood his ground and calmly gestured toward the front entrance where Greg Thompson had just exited, carrying his $20,000 in cash without interruption. "I watched him withdraw more than I'm asking for," Jonathan said, his tone measured, controlled. There was no hesitation, no extra steps. You smiled at him, counted his money out carefully. And yet, when I make a request nearly identical, I'm told it's suspicious. He didn't raise his voice or flinch. He didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. The message in his words wasn't angry, it was surgical, precise. Because Jonathan knew that the most dangerous bias didn't scream. It whispered. It hid behind protocol. Rachel Cooper blinked her fingers, tensing around the edge of the withdrawal form still resting between them. For a fleeting second, her face twitched with something almost like uncertainty. But then, without answering, her eyes darted past Jonathan's shoulder toward the back of the branch. Behind the glass wall of her office, the branch manager, Deborah Langston, stood watching, mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a dark green blazer with a silk blouse underneath. Deborah had the kind of poise that came with years of quietly ruling a space without having to speak. She didn't smile, she didn't move. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the scene in front of her, and then in the subtlest of motions, she gave a nod, barely perceptible, but deeply understood. That single nod changed everything. Rachel straightened, as though a current had run through her spine. Her expression, already distant, became glacial. Whatever flicker of uncertainty she might have felt was gone, buried beneath the silent validation from someone in power. When she looked at Jonathan again, her gaze no longer held discomfort. It held resolve, not the kind that comes from confidence in one's ethics, but the kind built on being backed by a system that rarely challenges itself. She folded her arms across her chest and shook her head slowly. Like I said, she replied, her voice flat. We can't process this transaction without further verification. The form remained untouched between them, but now it had become more than paper. It had become a wall. Jonathan recognized the shift instantly. It was the kind of invisible hand that guided so many moments in his life, a silent agreement between colleagues where one glance could say everything without saying a word. This wasn't about policy. It never had been. It was about appearance, about power, about the unspoken rule that some people walked into spaces and were granted trust while others had to earn it over and over again. His shoulders stayed relaxed, but his jaw tensed slightly, not out of shock, but out of bitter familiarity. Around them, the bank continued its morning rhythm. Keyboards clicked, printers hummed, conversations floated softly through the air. But at that counter, a quiet battle was unfolding. One where decorum cloaked discrimination. Customers shifted slightly in the line behind him, pretending not to notice, though their glances betrayed them. A few tellers nearby had grown quiet, their eyes flicking toward Rachel and Jonathan before quickly darting away. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Jonathan leaned in just a bit closer, his voice low but firm. You received everything you needed to complete this transaction, and yet here we are. He paused, watching her eyes, searching for even a flicker of self-awareness. There was none. Just the icy posture of someone who believed they were right, not because they had reason, but because they had reinforcement. And that's when Jonathan realized Deborah Langston had already made her decision. She wasn't waiting to gather facts. She was watching her subordinate enforce what she silently sanctioned. And now that prejudice had a witness, and soon it would have consequences. The hush in the bank deepened as Deborah Langston finally stepped away from her glass-walled office and approached the counter. Her heels clicked against the polished tile floor, crisp and deliberate, announcing her arrival like a gavel, with a poised expression and a calm voice crafted through years of executive decorum. She spoke with a forced smile, the kind not meant to comfort, but to control. Good morning, sir. She began, addressing Jonathan as if they were strangers on a sales floor. I understand you're attempting a high-value withdrawal today, and we simply need to take a few extra steps to ensure everything aligns with our security protocols. Her words were polished to perfection, yet hollow, carefully chosen to appear neutral, but designed to shield the deeper issue beneath. Jonathan stood firm, not angry, not loud, just present. His ID had been handed over, his withdrawal slip filled out correctly. His account number provided, every box was checked. But now the conversation had pivoted, not around facts, but around optics, around how suspicion was shaped by who stood on the other side of the counter. You didn't ask for extra steps with the previous customer. Jonathan said, his tone calm but unflinching. He withdrew more than I'm asking for. You smiled at him. counted out his money. No delays, no questions. And I'm asking you what exactly changed. His question floated in the air like a mirror held up to their behavior, but Deborah's expression didn't waver. Deborah responded with an air of professional detachment. Each transaction is unique. Mr. Harris, we review them case by case. In your instance, we just need to verify the source of the funds and confirm your most recent deposit. She gestured vaguely toward the form, then to the teller beside her, as if they were all just following a checklist. But Jonathan wasn't new to this game. My paycheck, he replied plainly. Same one I've deposited here every 2 weeks for the last 6 years. He let that sit for a moment, watching her carefully. You have my account. You have my history. You can see it on your screen. So again, what exactly about me triggers a different process? A flicker crossed Deborah's face just enough to betray that she knew the answer but wasn't willing to say it. And that's when Jonathan said it for her. It's not protocol, he said softly, but with unmistakable weight. It's profiling. The words struck the air like a hammer. Rachel shifted behind the counter, her arms crossing tighter across her chest. The nearby teller 2 stations over went still, her eyes frozen on her screen. Deborah didn't respond at first, perhaps stunned by the bluntness or simply calculating her next move. But Jonathan wasn't done. You're applying rules that don't exist until someone like me stands at this counter, someone not dressed in a suit, someone you didn't expect to walk in here asking for his own money. His words were precise, not spiteful. He didn't want to shame them. He wanted to hold up the truth, raw and undisguised. Deborah, to her credit, didn't deny it outright. But her silence, her refusal to acknowledge the disparity said enough. The atmosphere had changed now. Customers were pretending to stay focused on their phones, but their eyes were betraying curiosity. The tellers had slowed their pace ears, tuning in beneath the quiet rhythm of keystrokes. Jonathan stayed where he was, steady breathing evenly, not because he didn't feel the sting, but because he'd felt it too many times before. The difference today was simple. This wasn't just another moment to endure, it was a moment that would be remembered. There was a moment, brief, barely visible, where the dynamic in the room shifted entirely. Deborah Langston didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her fist or make a scene. Instead, she simply lifted her hand and gave the smallest of gestures, a tilt of the chin, a flick of the wrist, in the direction of the lobby. It was subtle, but Jonathan caught it. So did the man standing by the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a no-nonsense gait. Tyler Brooks, the bank's lead security officer, straightened from his post and began walking toward them. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. His expression was unreadable, molded into the neutral professionalism that masks silent compliance. Jonathan didn't move. He had expected this, felt it coming like thunder beneath a clear sky. The air in the bank grew dense, the silence sharpening as every eye began to notice the slow, deliberate approach of the guard. But Jonathan wasn't afraid. He had stood in rooms like this before, rooms where people smiled while closing doors in his face, rooms where silence gave permission for injustice to unfold. So instead of stepping back, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a calm hand, he unlocked the screen and tapped the record button. "You're refusing to process my withdrawal," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the hum of discomfort in the room. "Despite me having identification, account, verification, and full transaction history. Despite processing a larger withdrawal for a white customer just before me." The words didn't echo, but they landed. Rachel shifted behind the counter, her eyes darting between Jonathan and Deborah. A couple nearby customers stopped pretending to read their emails. One man's jaw tightened. Another woman clutched her purse tighter, as if bracing for confrontation, but still no one spoke, no one intervened. Tyler reached the counter and stopped just a step away from Jonathan. He was built like a linebacker, posture, firm hands at his sides, his uniform immaculate. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step outside," he said, his voice low, almost gentle but not optional. Jonathan didn't budge. His phone remained raised, his gaze steady. "And if I don't," he asked, not as a challenge, but as a test. Tyler's jaw flexed. He didn't answer. Instead, his hand moved forward with mechanical precision, wrapping around Jonathan's forearm in a grip that was firm, not violent, but not respectful either. Jonathan barely had time to brace before he was yanked sideways, his feet stumbling against the glossy tile floor. His shoulder knocked into Tyler's chest, and in one sharp motion he was turned toward the exit, propelled by a pressure meant to subdue, not persuade. A hush fell over the bank. One woman gasped. A man muttered, "What the hell?" But didn't move. Jonathan was shoved again, this time hard enough that his back hit the glass door. It swung open from the impact, spilling him into the cold morning air outside. Behind him, Tyler stood like a sentry, arms folded, unmoved by the force he had just used. The phone was still in Jonathan's hand, recording. His breath caught against the brisk wind, but he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The world had already seen enough to know what this was, and then came the final insult. As Jonathan steadied himself on the sidewalk, the door creaked open once more. Tyler stood in the frame holding something in his hand, Jonathan's ID, the same ID they had refused to acknowledge, the same ID that confirmed exactly who he was. Without a word, Tyler tossed it. It landed on the concrete at Jonathan's feet with a dull plastic clatter. He didn't bend to pick it up. Not yet. He stood there, eyes burning. Not with rage, but with something heavier, something ancient, something that came from knowing exactly how the world would frame this moment if he weren't the man that he was. The wind bit sharper outside the doors of Summit First Credit. Jonathan stood still, his shoulders squared, phone still in hand, recording now the silence of his removal rather than the violence of it. The air felt heavier than it should have, like it had absorbed everything the room inside had refused to confront. He didn't bend to retrieve the ID lying on the ground, yet he couldn't. There was something too symbolic about it now, too bitter. A reminder that even when you built the house, they'd still ask you to knock. Then out of the corner of his eye a figure moved, Malcolm Reed, mid-30s, black in the same dark security uniform as Tyler stepped forward from where he had been stationed near the side entrance. His pace was slower, less performative. No quick strides, no puffed-up authority. His eyes locked onto the small plastic card near Jonathan's feet, and without saying a word, he crouched down, picked it up with careful hands, and brushed off the dust with his sleeve. His movements weren't rushed, they were reverent, thoughtful, as if he wasn't just holding an ID, but everything it stood for. When he rose, he didn't hand it back right away. He looked at Jonathan with an expression layered in years, a look of recognition, not just of the man in front of him, but of the pattern, the scene, the weight. "Here," he said quietly, finally extending the card. "They always do this." His voice was low, the kind that doesn't beg to be heard, but leaves an imprint when it is. Jonathan took the card slowly, fingers brushing Malcolm's. There was a brief pause, thick with more understanding than a whole room of people inside had managed to muster. Malcolm looked down the street, then back at the glass doors where Tyler still stood, arms folded like nothing had happened. "Doesn't matter what you wear. Doesn't matter what you've built." "You could be the guy who wrote the damn employee manual," Malcolm muttered, shaking his head. "And they'll still treat you like you don't belong." The second you stop looking like they expect, his words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They were shaped by too many years of quiet endurance, of watching injustice unfold while standing still in the name of professionalism. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He let Malcolm speak not just for himself, but for every person who had ever had to bite their tongue in the name of keeping a job. For every time someone like Malcolm had to look away while someone like Tyler acted on behalf of unspoken rules. "We're the ones they use to make the place look diverse," Malcolm said, his voice dipping lower. "We're the photos on the website, the guys in the lobby, security janitors, assistants. We keep our heads down, do everything right. And still, they remind us that the top ain't for us." The words hit harder than a shove, not because they were new, but because they were true. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight, not in anger, but in agreement. Malcolm wasn't telling him anything. He didn't know, But hearing it out loud in this moment from someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by saying it, it mattered. It meant that even in the silence of complicity, there were still voices brave enough to whisper the truth. Malcolm took a step back, glancing once more through the bank's glass facade. "This ain't new," he said almost to himself now. "But maybe today's the last time it plays out like this." Jonathan didn't say anything. He didn't have to, because something was shifting. Not just in the bank, but in him, in Malcolm. In the moment, and that shift, however small, was how real change always begins. Jonathan stood in the cold morning light, his phone still in hand, though now the recording had stopped. What he had captured was enough more than enough. But this wasn't going to be resolved with a video clip or a strongly worded complaint. This moment required more than exposure. It required power. Not power born of pride or ego, but the kind that had been built through decades of service trust and unwavering integrity. So Jonathan opened his phone again this time, not to record, but to call. He scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in months, Charles Whitman, the chairman of Summit First Credit, and the man who had mentored him from day one. When Charles picked up, Jonathan didn't need to explain much. "I need you at the Chicago branch," he said simply. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm the weight of those words. Then came the response. 15 minutes. The minutes passed like hours. Inside, Jonathan could see the bank moving on as if nothing had happened. Deborah was back behind the counter, speaking to Rachel in hushed tones. Their faces were taut, controlled, rehearsed. Tyler, the security guard, still stood by the door, his arms folded like a sentry, unaware the tide was about to turn. Some customers had disappeared. Others pretended not to notice the shift in energy, avoiding Jonathan's gaze even through the glass. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He waited, silent, steady. The fire inside him, banked but burning. And then, like clockwork, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened before the engine had fully stopped, and out stepped Charles Whitman, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and dressed in a navy suit that spoke not of status, but of stewardship. He didn't carry the air of someone who needed to assert dominance. His presence alone redefined the space. He glanced once at Jonathan, saw the set of his jaw, the fire behind his silence, and nodded without a word. Then he turned and walked toward the glass doors, each step purposeful, each second pushing back against the injustice that had taken root inside. The moment Charles entered the bank, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of polite conversation stopped. Rachel froze mid-sentence. Deborah's back stiffened instantly as she spotted him. "Whitman," she said, her voice faltering for the first time, trying to slip into professionalism. But Charles didn't offer pleasantries. He didn't even look at her directly. He turned to Jonathan, who had followed a few steps behind him, and said clearly, "What happened?" Jonathan didn't need to elaborate his presence outside his position as CEO. The silence inside the bank, they all told the story better than words could. Charles listened with his posture, his stillness, his absolute refusal to ignore what was unfolding. Then Charles turned slowly to face the staff. His expression didn't carry outrage, it carried consequence. "Can someone explain to me," he said, his voice low but lethal, "why my CEO was just forcibly removed from his own bank?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Rachel looked to Deborah. Deborah's mouth opened, but no words came out. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Charles continued. "This was targeted, deliberate, and disgraceful, and I want to know now who made the call." His eyes narrowed as he looked from one face to the next, not to shame, but to expose. There were no takers. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she tried to summon a defense. "It was protocol," she began. But Charles held up a hand. "Protocol," he said, voice cutting, "or prejudice dressed up in policy." He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His words were scalpel sharp, slicing through the layers of polite ignorance that had coated the morning like lacquer. Tyler shifted his stance, glancing down at his shoes. Even customers nearby paused their transactions, pretending not to eavesdrop, but now fully tuned in. The truth had arrived, and it spoke with the kind of authority you couldn't fake. Charles turned to Deborah at last. "You had the opportunity to do the right thing," he said. "You chose silence instead, and now you'll answer for that." His voice was final. And though he didn't shout, everyone in the room felt the walls close in. The hierarchy had reversed. The invisible chain of approval that had given Rachel confidence earlier had just snapped. And as Charles stepped aside, giving Jonathan room to walk back in, it was clear to everyone the man they had dismissed was the man who had built everything they stood in. For a moment, the entire bank stood still. The atmosphere inside was electric, thick with discomfort, confusion, and quiet anticipation. Charles Whitman stepped forward, his gaze scanning the room like a judge surveying a courtroom before delivering a final verdict. Then, with the calm of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, he turned to face the stunned staff gathered near the teller counters. "You've all met Mr. Harris," he said, his voice clear, steady. "But what you failed to recognize, what you refused to acknowledge, is that Jonathan Harris isn't just a customer." He paused just long enough for the tension to thicken. "He is the Chief Executive Officer of Summit First Credit, your CEO." A collective gasp rippled through the room, not loud, but powerful. Rachel Cooper's jaw dropped, her fingers going limp at her sides. Deborah Langston, who had once held herself with silent authority, now stood frozen, the color draining from her face. Tyler, the security guard, blinked slowly, as if trying to process what he had just heard. The weight of the revelation landed like a hammer, and with it, the entire narrative, everything they thought they knew, shattered at their feet. Because in a single sentence, the illusion of justified protocol had been replaced with the undeniable truth they had profiled and humiliated the very man who signed their paychecks. Charles didn't stop to let the shock wear off. "Deborah," he said, his voice firm but not raised, "you're dismissed. Effective immediately." Deborah opened her mouth to speak, but Charles raised a hand. "No explanations, no damage control. You had a choice. You chose bias over integrity, and there is no place for that in this institution." Her lips quivered slightly as she searched for words that wouldn't come. The icy certainty that had once hardened her eyes was gone, melted into something close to panic. She glanced at Jonathan, perhaps hoping for a lifeline, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. Justice in that moment was louder than any speech. He turned next to Rachel, whose trembling hands gripped the edge of the counter, as if it might anchor her in place. "You'll be required to attend mandatory racial bias and ethics training." Charles said, his tone clipped. "And if I ever hear of another incident like this, you won't get the benefit of retraining, you'll be removed." Rachel nodded quickly, her face pale, her voice caught somewhere between apology and shock. Around them, the staff who had watched the entire event unfold said nothing. Some looked away, some looked ashamed, but no one defended the actions they had so passively enabled. Then Charles did something unexpected. He turned to the side toward the quiet man who had stood by the glass entrance, not interfering, not demanding attention, but moving with quiet dignity when others failed. "Malcolm Reed." "You?" Charles said. Pointing slightly, Malcolm stiffened, unsure if he was being called out or commended. "You bent down to return your CEO's ID when no one else would even look him in the eye." Charles took a step forward. "You didn't make a speech. You didn't ask for attention. You simply did what was right." A beat passed. Then Charles nodded. "You're being promoted. Effective immediately. We need more people like you in positions of trust." Malcolm blinked, caught off guard, his lips parting as if to protest, but Charles held up a hand again, not to silence, but to reassure. "Quiet strength matters," he said. Especially in moments like this, Jonathan looked over at Malcolm, their eyes meeting, no words needed. It was respect passed without ceremony. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for those who had failed, but for those who had quietly endured. And finally, someone had seen it, acknowledged it, rewarded it. For once, doing the right thing wasn't just applauded, it was elevated. The mood in the room had changed, not just because power had spoken, but because truth had surfaced. Jonathan wasn't standing alone anymore. He wasn't just the man who had been thrown out. He was now the man who had walked back in, standing taller than ever, and those who had once looked through him now looked up to him or down in shame. Charles gave a final look around the room. "This isn't just about today," he said. "This is about every day after this. Let it be the last time anyone in this building forgets who we serve or who we are." The bank was quiet now, not in the way it had been earlier, filled with passive silence and quiet judgment, but in the way a room falls still after something seismic, after something shifts, the kind of quiet that follows truth. Jonathan Harris took a slow breath and stepped back through the glass doors of Summit First Credit. This time not as an outsider to be questioned, but as the CEO reclaiming what should never have been denied: his dignity, his space, his authority. No one stopped him. No one dared speak. The only sound was the steady rhythm of his footsteps on the polished tile floor steps that echoed louder now than ever before. He approached the counter, his institution, and Rachel Cooper, still visibly shaken, stepped aside immediately. She didn't speak. She didn't meet his eyes. She only gestured to the computer terminal, her hands trembling slightly. Jonathan didn't need instruction. He entered the transaction details himself. The same $15,000 withdrawal he had requested earlier appeared on the screen in seconds. No questions, no delay. The printer hummed softly. The bills were counted twice carefully and stacked with perfect precision. This time, no one labeled it suspicious. No one asked for additional verification, because now the weight of truth sat in every corner of the room watching. He took the stack of crisp bills, tucking most into the envelope that had been hastily provided, but before turning to leave, he paused. With a calm hand, he slid a portion of the money across the counter, not toward Rachel, not toward Deborah, but toward the man who had shown courage without spotlight. "Malcolm," he said, his voice low but sure, "take the day off, paid." Malcolm, still standing near the door, blinked in surprise. "Sir, I don't," Jonathan cut him off gently with a glance. "You've earned it." It wasn't about the money. It was about the recognition, the restoration. It was about saying, "I saw what you did," and it mattered. The envelope rested between them for a beat, and then Malcolm nodded slowly, reaching out to accept it. His fingers brushed the stack of bills with hesitation, as though unsure if he should take it. Not because he didn't want it, but because he wasn't used to being seen. "Not like this." "Thank you," he whispered. But Jonathan didn't respond with words. He simply gave Malcolm a nod, one that carried the full weight of shared understanding, and then turned toward the exit, toward the door that had so recently been slammed behind him. And then, just as he reached the glass frame, Jonathan stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he turned back. His gaze moved through the quiet crowd, past the tellers, past the customers, and finally landed on Deborah Langston. She stood stiffly near the manager's desk, arms crossed tightly, the same suit now looking less like authority and more like armor cracking at the seams. Their eyes met his steady, hers unsure, and then, in a voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard, Jonathan said 6 simple words. "You should have checked my ID." It wasn't a taunt, it wasn't revenge, it was a truth laid bare. A final reminder that the mistake wasn't just procedural, it was personal, that this hadn't been about protocol or paperwork, it had been about perception. And now that perception had consequences, Deborah didn't respond. She couldn't, because there was nothing left to say. Jonathan turned again, walked through the glass doors, and this time the air outside felt different, lighter, like justice had finally opened the door he'd been forced to exit through not long ago. As he stepped into the daylight, Malcolm followed behind, not as a subordinate, but as someone standing a little taller. The world hadn't changed in an instant, the struggle wasn't over, but in that moment, on that sidewalk beneath that cold Chicago sky, something had shifted. And sometimes the first step toward reclaiming respect is simply refusing to leave without it. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something deeper, don't just scroll past. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you real stories that challenge injustice, expose quiet courage, and remind us all of the dignity every person deserves. If you believe in the power of truth, in the strength of character over titles, and in the importance of standing up even when it's uncomfortable, join our community. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that go beyond the surface. And remember to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment that matters.